Stavnak, and welcome to part 2 in my video series on how to make an album or project in the OPZ. In our last video, we talked about some arranging techniques to get the most out of the patterns and 8 tracks in the OPZ, along with some mixing techniques and getting the best of mix. In this video, we're going to talk about getting the track in your OPZ outside of it and into the DAW. So let's talk about the 2 main methods that I see people recording the OPZ. The first one is what I would call the manual stem or manual multi-track recording. And this process is basically you get your pattern chain together, you go into your track and you mute everything except the kick track. And then you hit play and you record the kick track into your DAW. Then you go back and then you record the snare track into your DAW and so forth. And you probably get the idea is, you record everything, individual tracks, and then now you have the stems inside the DAW. Now the pros, obviously, to this are, boom, you get multi-tracking. This is something that a lot of people have wanted, myself included, is the ability to multi-track the OPZ. And this allows you to do that. You now have all the parts in the OPZ separated out inside your DAW. And this is really great because now you can do all the mixing you want. You can change up the arrangement in post. The cons to this method, and why I ultimately don't do it, is it removes all of the performance aspects of it. And I feel like that's kind of what makes the OPZ so great, is you have these punch-in effects, you have the tape deck, you have the master track, and these other, and being able to manually control the parameters and automation, like, you kind of lose out on that, I feel like. And if I record this way, then I don't really get to use the mute groups for that because they're being used to actually mute the tracks as I'm recording them. So that's why ultimately I decided not to do that. And I know, like, I could always do filter automations in post, or I could add some of those performance effects in post, but I really like, for me, I like being able to sit down, perform the track, and what I am playing is kind of what I'm going to end up getting in the end. And I feel like the times that I've looked at trying to multi-track by muting one track at a time, it kind of takes the life out of the tracks, at least for me. So the other method that I see, and that the method that I use, is where I am recording the main left-right out of the OPZ. And this is why I spend so much time getting great mix within the OPZ. But the caveat that kind of makes this different or special is that I'm also multi-tracking the MIDI data live at the same time. What this means is I'm getting all of the punch-in effects that I'm playing. Anytime I'm playing some keyboard part or something live while I'm performing the track, that's getting played in. The different punch-in effects or step components are also being recorded into the embedded MIDI. So, if I have a kick track that's 4 on the floor, but every third time there's another kick, like, that's reflected in the MIDI data. And what this allows me to do is, once I have everything recorded, I now have all of the data for all the different tracks that I can use to layer additional sounds or adjust a mix by layering other sounds. And I found this to be very helpful for me, and being able to get even more out of what the OPZ can do. The cons of this, obviously, is that you're recording a 2-track output. You don't get to go back and remix unless you re-record the whole track or redo the performance. And if you record the track and it sounds banger, and then you come back the next day and, like, the snare is, like, unbelievably loud, like, there's not much that you can do other than just re-record it, which kind of stinks. But I think that the pros outweighs the cons in this instance, especially if, when I'm recording a track, I'll do like a couple passes of it because, I make mistakes, and sometimes they're great mistakes that end up making the record, and other times it's just like, no, I completely missed that transition. Let me start over. So let's actually talk about specifically how I do this. Now, I can't take the credit for this. A lot of what I'm about to show you, I saw in a YouTube video from Microwaves TV, and I'll have a link in that below. Go check out that video after this, because he goes into much more detail into the MIDI implementation of the OPZ. I'm mainly using it to be able to get the individual MIDI tracks out of the OPZ into Ableton. But he goes into much further detail on like how to be able to route MIDI back to the OPZ, be able to sequence the OPZ from Ableton, and all sorts of other really cool stuff. So be sure to check out his video, leave him a like. But to start off, let's take a look over here at the OPZ. and let's look at our MIDI settings. So a lot of this doesn't make a huge difference, but the two really important ones I want to bring to your attention is to make sure that MIDI out is enabled, obviously, so that way you're sending MIDI over the USB cable. And then channel 1 to active track is disabled. What that does is whatever track that I'm currently on, you know, if I'm on the bass track here and I'm playing a bass line, when that's enabled, it's going to send that MIDI to channel 1, but I don't want that. I want channel 1 to always be the kick drum. So make sure you disable that, and make sure, typically I have MIDI in disabled because I'm not trying to send MIDI to the OPZ. And I'll typically have clock out enabled. I don't do a lot of transport stuff between Ableton and the OPZ. Microwaves video kind of goes into more detail on how to get that fleshed out. There's always latency between it anyway, so I just go and post and time align all the tracks to make sure they're all in sync. On the Ableton side of things, over here I have this template that I've created for when I am recording the OPZ. So let's take a look at our settings. We'll go over to MIDI, and over here you see when I have the OPZ, right now I have the OPZ plugged up via USB, and I have on the input, I have the track enabled, I have the sync enabled, and on the output I have track enabled. I don't think that is required to do what I'm about to show you, but that I typically have on in case I do want to send something back to the OPZ. And then last thing is you want to make sure back over here on the OPZ that all of the channels are actually corresponding to the correct MIDI channel. So kick is channel 1, snare 2, perc 3, and so forth, because sometimes I route things differently, so I just want to make sure all the channels are set to the correct channel number. And then over here in this template that I've made, you see I have up here the OPZ, which is going to be my main left-right audio. Right now I have the OPZ set as an audio interface, which if you didn't know that, if you plug the OPZ over USB, it does USB over audio, so you can have it as an interface. I typically don't do this when I record because the OPZ CPU seems to freak out really quickly, especially at lower buffer sizes, and you'll get this like weird digital artifacting / distortion type sound, which is not pleasant at all. It's the same sound I get whenever my CPU overloads. So the only way to fix that is to have a super high buffer size, and then it's really hard to perform with all that latency. And sometimes I still find that I'll get, you know, when I go back and listen to it, like it fuzzed out on me or whatever. So I'll typically just go line in, but that's kind of besides the point. So here I have my main OPZ audio, and I always like throwing a utility with bass mono enabled. So anything below 90 Hertz is sum to mono. That way my low end is nice and tight. And then over here, I'm OCD, so I like putting things in groups. So what I have here is I have all of the MIDI tracks grouped. So I have the kick track, snare, percussion, sample, and then the 4 synth tracks from the OPZ. And it's super simple. Just create a MIDI track, tell the MIDI to come from the OPZ, set channel 1, because you don't want all channels, and that's my kick. Snare, same thing, channel 2, percussion 3, sample 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So, and these are all of the, what would be normally the audio tracks in the OPZ. But I also have all of the effects tracks, the tape, the master, the performance, the module. I have all this other stuff. Now this is all kind of redundant in a lot of cases. I don't use this that often, but I record it anyway because sometimes it's handy, especially like, let's say I'm using the punch-in effect for like the synth filter sweep over here, leading from like the verse leading into a chorus. Sometimes it is handy that when after I have everything recorded, I'm in the DAW to be able to see the exact moment where I hit that button and started the filter sweep, because sometimes, you know, if I have other synths or something going on in here, I can use the filter sweep MIDI to help with that. And it, you know, it doesn't take up any extra processing, so why not? But you don't need that. So let's go ahead and arm all these tracks. And let's give a little demo of how this actually works. So first of all, you want to make sure that your tempo is the same. There's been a couple times I've hit record and my tempo is off, and that just causes issue. So now that I have everything recorded, if you look, when I hit play, you should see the little channels lighting up whenever a channel is activated. So let's go ahead and record just a little bit of this song. I like having a little bit of count in so that everything is nice and aligned. And let's go. All right, let's let that tail fade out. So now we have our audio and our MIDI all recorded together. So this is great. Now if I wanted to layer in an additional kick, or maybe just the top end of an additional kick, or I wanted to add some more percussion, or I wanted to double the chords with a different additional synth, I can. Now, there are some issues with this that I've noticed, and I'm going to pull up one of my tracks off of my new EP, Breath. This track is called Convolution. All right, so now here we are in my song, Convolution. When you're recording your song, make sure to do a few passes, just in case you make any mistakes. Sometimes you can comp together multiple passes. Like in this one, I think, yeah, see, I adjusted the end a little bit. I think I ended it a little late, so I was able to crossfade and still make it nice. I also here, I added just a little filter sweep, so it's still mostly the OPZ. But over here, you notice all those other MIDI tracks that I had, there's not as many here, because once I get towards the tail end, I'll just delete the tracks I don't need, or like hide them in another folder. So if you look at this song, I end up using only the kick, the percussion, the effects or sample track, and then I end up doubling the lead and the chord tracks with a VST. Now, one thing that keep in mind that I've noticed is there is a delay between the audio, when the audio is recorded, and when the MIDI data is recorded. And that typically is pretty easily fixed. You just manually go in, I grab the whole track, and when I would record, sometimes it would look like this, sometimes it will look like this, and so I just go in and I grab all of the MIDI tracks, except for this, and I can move it around and time align it. Now the only problem with this that I've noticed is if I go over here, and let's say, see how this is off? If I go over here and I time align this to where like, all right, these are now perfectly in sync. In theory, that means that the whole track should be in sync. But if I go all the way to the end, see, you can kind of, if we go all the way to the end, you can kind of see how the transient here and the MIDI data here is not perfectly in sync. And this particular track actually isn't that bad as far as the syncing is concerned, but for whatever reason, there seems to be some level of MIDI drift to where they're not always perfectly in time. Obviously, in this song, it wasn't bad enough where I could actually hear it. I could actually kind of time align. Some of the tracks in my Transcendence album, I actually had to go in and manually move around some of the kicks to make sure that they were actually in phase with the kick on the OPZ audio, which is kind of a pain. And you really aren't going to notice this issue except on things like your kick drum or percussion. Like a slow evolving pad, if it's like, half a millisecond off from the one in the OPZ, you're not going to hear the difference. And sometimes with like a snare or hi-hat that can be pleasing, it adds a little bit more liveliness to the pattern. But that's just something to be aware that going to the very beginning of the phrase and time aligning the first MIDI hits doesn't always mean it's going to be in line the entire time. So just something to be aware of. But in this track, let's take a listen to this main section. Now this is just going to be the OPZ. I do have some processing on it, as you can see, but not a whole lot. Just a little bit of multiband on the low end because it got a little muddy, and I have some automation EQs at different sections. So let's take a listen to just the OPZ. So you can hear it's not super in your face like all the differences, but it's subtle. Like in this main section, I'm doubling the kick, and I have some additional chords and leads, just adding a little bit more space and width to everything. And I think that's a great use of like this extra MIDI data that sometimes the OPZ may not be able to get as much depth or as much width or as much ambience as I would like. And in here, I can just layer on an additional, I have a VST from Native Instruments to just add more lush. Let's move on to the next section where we're really talking about how the mindset that I have when I'm doing this kind of thing. Because when I was making the track in the OPZ, I was trying to get everything to be as great of a mix as I can possibly get. And then in here, I can like, if there's something I missed, like, oh, the kick drum wasn't as powerful enough, or, maybe I just wanted a different sound layered kick drum, like I can layer this in here. Or in this case, I had the little ping, at the beginning. If I go over here and solo this, I have that little ping that kind of got buried. So in here, I just was able to layer it in, pan it to the side, add a little bit more ambience to it to let it pop in the mix a little bit better. One important thing, we talked about this in the previous section, was frequency masking and how easily that can happen in the OPZ. You also want to be super careful because like if you already have a very dense mix in the OPZ, throwing other stuff on top of it is only going to make it worse. So one thing that I did was like, for this synth, I made sure I was cutting off a lot of that mud. And let me pull up my Pultec here. So this is EQ that I had on this synth track, and I'm cutting out, I'm shelving off a lot at 100, I'm dipping a lot in 200, and I'm boosting up at 500 because I don't need a lot of that low end and low mids from this chord track. If we listen to it, it's a lot of just upper mids and high end stuff, a lot of air, because I already have a lot of body from this. So when you do layer something in, don't just layer, if you're gonna do this method, you're gonna layer extra sounds in, don't just layer for the sake of layering. Listen to the parts and how they play off each other. And if you feel like, hey man, I wish the chords had more ambience, or I wish the lead was a little dirtier, or I wish the kick had more attack, use these layering techniques to add those elements that are missing. Because if you just layer in additional chords and additional leads, it's just going to get muddy so quickly, and it's going to be really hard to fix. I try to keep, and I think you heard in this example, the end product and what I ended up recording straight from the OPZ wasn't that far away. I like to say the last 10% or last 20% to get it ready for release. And that's kind of philosophy I have. In some cases, I think one of my songs, the low end on the OPZ track was just not, it was just too much. It was boomy, it was muddy. And sometimes what I end up doing is shelving off a lot of the low end and then using the MIDI data for the kick and bass to take over the sub frequencies. I think I had to do that in like 1 or 2 tracks on my Transcendence album because it wasn't playing nice together. So I ended up throwing a Pultec on it and shelving off, at like 60 hertz or 100 hertz, and then creating a very simple, boring sub bass sound using the MIDI data and using that for my sub frequencies. Because I still had all the mids, lower mids, upper mids of the bass sound in the actual OPZ file. I just needed to add a little bit extra using the MIDI data. So I hope this has been informative. I hope this gives you some more inspiration. Like I said, I created my Transcendence album and my Breath album using this method. I have found it to be very successful. The key highlights to take away is to make sure that you get a good mix in the OPZ itself. Go in with the mindset of like, hey, I'm going to release this song just from the OPZ. Record that. Then go in, and when you're mixing or adding, bus processing to the OPZ, if you want to add something else or make a certain part more prominent, then reach for the MIDI data that you have recorded and use that to accentuate. This is actually an example where I had a lot more going on in the MIDI data. A lot of my tracks, typically I may only double like 2 parts, maybe 3 parts. Some tracks only 1 part. Like it all depends on the track. Use it to your advantage. Try out both methods. Try multi-tracking individually and then try doing it this way. I think a lot of it depends on your workflow, and if you prefer to have a bunch of audio in a DAW that you can slice up and, you know, kind of completely break down the song and recreate it in the DAW, then use that method. If you like being able to maintain the integrity of the song that you had in the OPZ, or, you know, like me, I want to be able to, anything that I release, I want to be able to take it to the stage immediately and be able to perform it. So I try to maintain what I had in the OPZ in the final mix. You can give this a try. The OPZ is an incredibly inspiring device. I think its strong points is a live performance and being able to sit down and come up with great ideas quickly. While it may be limiting in some of its mixing or sound design capabilities, it makes up for that in the fact that, like, it still sounds amazing, and you can get a lot of great ideas out of it and these like generative, always changing patterns. I definitely think the OPZ is an amazing sequencer. It's definitely the best that I've ever used. I hope this has been informative. I hope this wasn't just, you know, me ranting on and how I made my album. But if you have any questions, be sure to drop them in the comments. I'd be more than happy to answer them. I plan to do some other tutorial videos. I know right now I've been designing my modular set, and I plan on multi-tracking the modular set with it all being controlled by the OPZ, so expect some videos on that pretty soon. Thank you for coming out. This has been Davnak. Enjoy the rest of your day.